Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Brian Hoskins from Oklahoma State University in Fire Protection Safety Engineering Technology. And this module is the concluding module of the series that you've been watching by both Dr. Virginia Charter and myself, covering codes and standards and the different types of standards, how they all interrelate. The purpose of this module is going to be to just review what that organization process was and the different standard organizations who are involved with that, as well as looking at the role of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, in the standards process. So far, and if you have not seen these previous modules, highly recommend that go back, review them as needed to give you that information and detailed knowledge, because this short module not going to cover all the details that you may need to know and understand that we've covered in those previous ones. So the first module was an introductory module, laying the groundwork for what was to be covered. Then we talked about a module on American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and the role of ANSI is really as that overarching standards development organization within the United States, and we'll review this more in detail in the coming slides. Then the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, the International Code Council, ICC, looked at design, inspection, testing, and maintenance standards, as well as then finally covering product standards. So what are those different ones? What do they do? How do they work? So ANSI, the module on ANSI really gets into what ANSI does, which is ANSI doesn't necessarily write that many standards themselves. Instead, their role is more as the representative for the United States on international standard organizations, which we haven't talked about too much, but there are, beyond the national ones, international standards that have each country getting one representative on it, and it's ANSI who represents the U.S. there. ANSI also helps to make sure that the U.S. codes and standards can be adopted elsewhere and are protected throughout the world with what's been done in the U.S. and making sure that we get harmonization and conformity with things around the world, because if products which we import come in, have to make sure that they can be compatible with the ones we already have. And so that's sort of ANSI's main job, is being that international representative of the standards industry in the United States. Then there's National Fire Protection Association. Now, we really covered the NFPA in depth because the National Fire Protection Association is vital in fire protection engineering. Fire protection is in their name, and it sort of implies that, yes, it would be applicable here as well. So the main purpose of NFPA, as far as standards goes, is to come up with and develop the standards for both model codes in the terms of NFPA 101, as well as looking at those design, testing, maintenance standards on all the fire protection systems. We'll mention in that module how the NFPA standards are commonly referenced for things like suppression systems in other code organization standards and codes. For example, the International Building Code by ICC references NFPA 13 for sprinkler system design. And so you really have to be familiar with those NFPA standards and processes to really get into all those different types of codes and standards. Then we have a module on the International Code Council. International Code Council, one of the primary things they do from a fire protection standpoint is they write the International Building Code and the International Fire Code. While NFPA has equivalent versions of these in NFPA 101 and NFPA 1, it is the IBC codes that get adopted in, or the ICC codes that get adopted in many jurisdictions. And so if you're in a jurisdiction that's adopted it, you have to be familiar with it, understand how it works, how it's organized. Now, the two code organizations are fairly similar. They have similar type processes, although we'll discuss the differences between those in the other modules. But they are ones that give, again, that model code of when something is to be installed. Then we talk about the design, installation, and maintenance and testing standards, most of which are written by NFPA. And that when we're looking at how do we maintain, design our fire protection systems, NFPA has been the leader in that area. Now, the purpose of these standards is really to help the user understand what it is that has to be done in order to get the system to work effectively. So the model codes like NFPA 101 or the IBC say you will install smoke detectors. Well, what does that mean? How many should you put in? How should they be installed? NFPA 72 is going to be the standard you go to determine how many smoke detectors you need in the space, where they're going to be located. It's the model codes that just tell us when it is that they're required. It's these standards that tell us how we're going to do it, and after they've been installed, have to make sure they still work. So what's that maintenance and testing that's going to be required. And then we have the product standards. So the role of the product standards by companies like UL and FM is when those design standards say, yes, you're going to install a sprinkler system, for example, and use K5.6 heads. What does that mean? How do we know that a sprinkler is actually going to deliver what it needs to be done? Well, that comes from the UL standard on sprinkler heads. They get tested, and based on the flow characteristics and the distribution of the water, it gets approved to be one, or gets listed as one, that can then work as that specified sprinkler. And so those were the primary focus of the different modules. But I think it's also important here in this module, as you've been exposed to how those different codes and standards in fire protection work together, the different hierarchies, how to sort of navigate and find information and what to do, I want to talk a little bit in detail about NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. So NIST, the key thing here is, what's their role? Well, one, they have is a grant through NIST that help pay for developing these modules. And so why they do that, why is this an important part of their mission? And NIST is really about making sure that standards are developed and in the United States, so that way we have products that all work together. So while NIST doesn't actively write standards, like the product standards or design standards in fire protection, what they're doing is helping to make the environments where it can be done. And if there's questions about, well, what's an acceptable measurement, that's where NIST sort of comes from, is getting proper measurements so that way we can get things standardized and have it so where the different standard organizations can then develop the standards that industry needs. And as we've shown, fire protection industry needs these standards, because if we don't have standardization, what ends up happening is, well, complete chaos essentially can ensue. And that I'll go here as an example. In the Great Baltimore Fire in 1904, fire burning throughout the city. And neighboring fire departments respond in order to help fight the fire as mutual aid, as is commonly done in many jurisdictions, even today, and it's definitely the case then. And so all those different jurisdictions arrived on scene, and no one else could hook into the hydrants that Baltimore had, because everyone had different size couplings on their hoses. And it was shortly, well, it was because of this incident and other ones like it, that one of NIST's primary charges, literally in the congressional mandate for NIST, is looking at fire protection, fire safety. And so having it so where all those different products work together, everything from, and I just give the example of the sprinkler heads. Well, I want to make sure that when a company comes up with a sprinkler head, that it'll work in the system as specified in NFPA 13, as required in the IBC. And so the only way all of those work together is if there's some standard set of recognition, cooperation, and mechanisms to determine how everything has to fit together. And that's really where NIST role comes in, is helping to make it so where standards are emphasized, are an important thing. And NIST will conduct testing to be involved with gathering data to inform those standards. So while NIST doesn't actually write any of the standards that we've talked about, NIST staff members do volunteer and serve on standards technical committees for a number of these different standards. And NIST has conducted research to give the codes information that they need, and codes and standards information that they need to make informed decisions about what's an acceptable level based on actual data. Because without data, without some kind of testing, how do we necessarily know what's sufficient or not? And so NIST is thoroughly involved in that standards process throughout every phase of it, really. And grateful to them for this grant, and think that it is something that is vital to the industry, having these standards and NIST cooperation with that. And so we showed you this pyramid back in the introductory module, and we've gone through it repeatedly, maybe not directly on the screen, but really it's how everything builds. And so we have those model codes, things like NFPA 101, things like the International Building Code, and those get adopted by a local jurisdiction. And so that then becomes the law for that city, for that state, that they're going to follow. Now, they can make amendments to it, as we've talked about, but it sets that guideline, so now we have a consistent type of approach throughout the country, throughout the region. Now, those model codes are going to call upon the design standards, the maintenance standards, about how to actually get those systems in the building. So they're not going to go through the details of, in many cases, here's how many sprinkler heads you're going to put in, or here's how many smoke detectors you're going to put in, or here's how many pull stations, or fire extinguishers, or whatever it is. It's just going to say that they're required and follow those standards. And to maintain them, follow the appropriate standard. Well, those standards then, the design, inspection, testing, and maintenance standards, are then going to reference the product standards. So they'll say that you have to put in a product that meets a UL standard, for example, to make sure that the product will actually function as needed in that design standard. And as I said, the local jurisdiction is going to adopt all these. So all those ones in blue on your screen there, those are ones that were developed by third-party organizations like NFPA, like ICC, like UL, and they develop them. They're not legally binding anywhere until they get adopted into law. And so that's a political process that gets done. And then beyond that, you have then the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, who's going to be the one going out and actually enforcing and making sure that the codes and standards are being applied effectively within their jurisdiction. And so every part of that pyramid is important. We've definitely emphasized those bottom three layers in the different modules, but it's also important to recognize that just because something gets put into a code or standard, for example, just because residential sprinkler systems have been put into the code in NFPA 101 or the IBC, does not mean therefore it's going to be adopted into law everywhere or necessarily enforced everywhere, even sometimes when it has been adopted. And so those are important parts of this process, and making sure that the key components, that you understand what's going on, not just in the model generic codes, but also what your local jurisdiction has done. And if you do not pay attention to what the local jurisdiction has adopted, you can run into significant problems and limitations as you try to get your design, and it keeps getting rejected because there's a local amendment that you're not following. So what are some of the takeaways from today? So wanted to make sure that you understood what the different standard organizations are. As I said, today's been a high-level overview of those different types of organizations, the different types of standards, and really recommend that for more details, you go and review the previous modules in this series. And then we talked some about NIST and the role that NIST plays in making sure that standards and standards are adopted and developed within the United States based on sound measurement techniques and theories to have ones that are robust, that can serve the needs of industry. So thank you for watching this video as well as the entire series.